Turn your Bibles, if you will, to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. We're continuing tonight in a spiritual lesson series where we take a story from the Bible, study that story, and then make spiritual application with what we've been doing for several weeks now. I think one of the ways that we can learn best from the Bible is to study what God has given us because it's put there for a reason, and then try to glean for ourselves how we can make that application in our lives. And I think every word that's been put in the Bible was put there for a reason, and it's up to us to try to figure that out for ourselves and what that means to us. So I'd like to read 1 Samuel chapter 17. I would like to read verses 45 through 47, just to start. Verses 45 through 47. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands. And I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." The story of David and Goliath has always been a fascinating story to most everyone. We teach it to our kids from little bitty, how David overcame Goliath with a sling and a stone, if you will. It's a fascinating story to us because it's a near impossible story if it wasn't for God being in it. And how David, this young man who was not a warrior, went out to that battlefield with bravery and courage and with God on his side and defeated a man he should have never been in any business defeating. And showing God's power to his people and showing God's power to us today. And so just to frame 1 Samuel 17, I want to give a little background here of how we got to this point in 1 Samuel 17. As you know, Israel wanted a king, and Samuel was bereaved about that. But God told Samuel that, well, they haven't rejected you, but they rejected me from being king. I'm going to give them a king. And so we see in 1 Samuel chapter 10 that God chooses Saul to be king, and he's anointed as king. If you remember, he was hiding in the baggage car. But he was a tall man. He looked like a king, if you will. And so Samuel took him and put him in front of the people and anointed him as king. And so he started out pretty good. He was a man who began his reign as king as 30 years old. He reigned for 40 years in Israel. We see in chapter 11 that the Spirit of God came upon Saul, and they made him, if you will, king there publicly, and he defeated the Ammonites as one of his first things that he did. So he's doing pretty good. And we see in chapter 12 that Samuel, after all of this, addresses the nation. And you can read that in 1 Samuel chapter 12. For Israel to keep faithful to God, to follow the king and keep faithful to God. However, in 1 Samuel 13, we see Saul's first mistake there. And there was war with the Philistines, and they had gathered at Gilgal, and they're waiting for Samuel to come and give the sacrifice. But it had been 7 days that had passed, and some of the people were leaving because they were losing heart. And so Saul was getting impatient, so he decided that he was going to give the sacrifice instead of Samuel. And lo and behold, when he was done with the sacrifice, guess who showed up? Samuel showed up to give the sacrifice. He had disobeyed God. And so because of that, Samuel tells him that your kingdom will not endure. In other words, you will be king, but your sons and your sons' sons will not be king. Your kingdom will not endure. You won't pass this on, if you will, to anybody else. And so we see that in chapter 14 that Saul is fighting the Philistines, and he gives that foolish order that no man should eat until they had been defeated. And Jonathan finds the honey, and he eats that honey. And then Saul finds out that he had eaten the honey, and he wanted to kill his own son. But the people saved Jonathan there from Saul killing his own son. And so we see in chapter 15, we see his second big mistake, if you will, that cost him. And that he was told to utterly destroy the Amalekites. And so he took that charge from Samuel and from God, and he went down, but he brought back Agag and the choices of the livestock, and he again began to make excuse. Well, the people wanted to bring this back to sacrifice to God, and see, I brought the king back. And Samuel tells Saul it's better to obey than sacrifice. And because of that act, God says, I'm taking the kingdom away from you. In other words, I no longer recognize you as king. The first was, your kingdom will not endure. It will, your son's sons are not going to sit on the throne. The second one was, you're no longer king as far as I'm concerned. And so this grieves Saul. He repents to an extent, and they offer sacrifice there. We see in chapter 16 that God tells Samuel, says, I've got another king in mind. I want you to go down to Bethlehem to the house of Jesse, and I've got somebody there for you anointed as king. And so Samuel goes down, and Jesse passes 7 of his sons before Samuel. Samuel looks at each one of them, and God says, not that one, not that one, not that one, not that one. And Samuel's wondering, perplexed. He says, what in the world is going on here? What's wrong? Can't you choose any of these? And he says, God says, I don't look at the outward appearance, I look at the heart. And then so Samuel says to Jesse, is there anybody else? Any more sons? He says, I got the youngest out there tending the flock, the 8th. David's out there tending the flock. And when David came in, God said, that's the man. The boy, actually, probably 13, 14, 15 years old at that point. The boy. That's going to be the king. Of course, Samuel anoints him there as king. And so David is recognized as king by God, but nobody else knows that he's king. Everybody thinks Saul is king, you see, because he did reign for 40 years, guys. And so all of this is happening. Saul's reign comes up, and so all of this with David is happening in the last 10 years of his reign, you see, as David begins to come on the scene. And so what God orchestrates in Samuel 17 is that we need to make David known to the people. So we need to do something here so David nationally would be known. Nobody knows who David is. He's a shepherd boy from Bethlehem, and Saul had been king for 30 plus years. Everybody thinks Saul is king. And so here we see in 1 Samuel chapter 17 that there is going to be a battle between Israel and between the Philistines. And so they array themselves for battle on 2 sides of a valley, if you remember. And the Bible tells us that they had been there for 40 days looking at one another. You know, a lot of times that does happen in ancient battles. They'll camp out for weeks, contemplating, looking at one another, strategy and so forth. They don't immediately start attacking, if you will. Sometimes that happens. But they're camped out on each side of this valley. And so we see here, beginning at verse 1, the Philistines had gathered their army. Saul and his men of Israel, in verse 2, were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountains on the other side, with the valley between them. And lo and behold, every single day, during those 40 days, a man named Goliath comes out. Verse 4. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines, Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. depending on who you read, that's anywhere from 8 to 10 feet tall, if you can imagine. And not only that, he had a bronze helmet on his head, and his clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. Those who study these things probably says he's probably weighing armor of upwards of 200 pounds. So he's a big, strong warrior, muscular man wearing bronze armor. Can you imagine wearing 200 pounds of armor? I don't think I could walk. I'd have to lay down. He had a shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, about yea big around was the shaft. Can you imagine? And the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. So he was a champion. He was of the Uruk, the giants, if you will, there. And so he comes out over these 40 days and he issues this challenge. It's a very simple challenge. He says basically in verses 8 through 10, you choose a champion, servants of Saul. And that if your champion defeats me, we become your servants. And if I defeat your champion, then you all become our servants. Because Saul, you see, had thrown off the yoke of the Philistines. He had been successful in fighting the Philistines, but it's still the war was going on. There was a lot of animosity between the Philistines and the nation of Israel. And so he issues this challenge. Can you imagine walking out every day and issuing this challenge? And it says here in verse 24 that they were greatly afraid of this man, as most people would be, if you will. And so we see here there's a pause in verses 12 through 19. As the scene shifts to David in Bethlehem. And Jesse is there. And it's been a long time. His three brothers has gone on to battle. Eliab and his three brothers have gone on to battle. They're at the scene, getting ready to fight. And so Jesse tells David, he says, I want you to take these supplies with you. I want you to take, verse 17, this roasted grain and 10 loaves, and go to the camp of your brothers, take this cheese to the commander of thousands, and look into the welfare of your brothers and bring back news. What's going on down there? Of course, we know they didn't have internet. They didn't have spy satellites. They didn't have telephones. They didn't have a telegraph. They didn't have anything to get communication other than go see what's going on. Perhaps a rumor would come here and there from people traveling through. But go down there and see what's going on. It's been a long time that they've been down there. And I'm sure Jesse was worried about his sons, wouldn't you? The welfare. Go down there and check. See what's going on, David. It's okay. He would do that. And so we see here in verses 20 through 26 that David, when he gets there, he hears, it's timed just right. When he gets down there, he hears this challenge from Goliath. When he gets there. Verse 20, so David arose early in the morning and left the flock. He came to the circle of the camp while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. So they've lined up once again for battle. And they're screaming at one another, if you will. Beating their shields, if you will. They drew up in battle array in verse 21. David leaves the baggage, the tents and places where he put those supplies. And he goes to the battle line. So here's this young boy, 13, 14, 15 years old, running up to the battle line wondering what's going on. Are they getting ready to fight, in other words, because he hears the noise. And as he was talking to them, probably his brothers and others, behold, here comes Goliath, verse 23, the champion from Gath. He comes up to the army of the Philistines. He spoke these same words in the hearing of David, the same words that he's been speaking every day. The same challenge that he had made every day. And verse 24, when all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. They backed away. They backed away. And so David David learned something here in verse 25. The men of Israel said, they're saying to one another, and David's hearing, have you seen this man who's coming up? Surely he's coming up to defy Israel. And it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. Now think about that. Saul had said, if anybody will go out here and fight this guy, I will make him very, very rich. I will give him my daughter in marriage, and he won't have to pay any taxes for the rest of his life. That's basically what he said. You're tax-free for the rest of your life. If you can go down there, and that would be part of the royal house, that'd be pretty good, right? That'd be pretty good. If any man would go down there and fight this guy, I will do this for him. But David asks a question, and sometimes this question is misunderstood. Verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? In other words, he's not saying, oh, is that some benefit that I can get? He's saying, oh, why in the world do you even need this incentive to go do it? Why would anybody need to do it? Just go do it, is basically what he's saying. What would be done for this man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? What's that got to do with the price of eggs in China? I mean, why would that even be something that you would consider? Just go down there and kill the guy, right? See, that's what it made his brothers mad, because it implies cowardice. Now, he didn't mean to imply cowardice, but he implied cowardice in Eliab and others, that you won't go down there because you're cowards. He didn't mean it. Look at what he says here. Verse 27, thus it will be done for the man who kills. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard what he had spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger burned against David, and he said, what have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle. That's your incentive to be here. David says, what have I done now? Was it not just a question? And he was right. He wasn't insinuating that they were cowards. He was just wondering why anybody would need this incentive to go down there to do it in the first place. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Think about it. 13, 14, 15-year-old boy telling grown men. Think about that. And he turned away from another, and he said the same thing. And the people answered before. He said, why in the world do you need that? Just go down there and do it. The people kept saying it. And so Saul hears about this, about David stirring things up. See, God is setting it up so people of the nation will know who he is. God's bringing this about, you see. And so Saul hears about this, that words that David spoke. And David said to Saul, when he was brought to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go down and fight the Philistine. I'll do it. I'll go down and fight him. Isn't that something? I'll go down and fight him. Yeah, I'll take care of him. And Saul's looking at this boy, and what in the world are you talking about? This man here is a warrior, and you're not a warrior. He's been a warrior from his youth, and you're just but a youth. He's been a warrior for years and years and years. He's seen battle time and time again. He's an experienced veteran. And you think you, as a boy who's never seen battle in your life, can go down there and defeat this guy? But David tells him a story. It's interesting the way Saul listens to the story. David tells him a story. Notice here, verse 34. Your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. I went out after him and attacked him and rescued him from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Quite a story, isn't it? Now think about it for just a minute. If a bear or a lion attacked the sheep, you and I would stand no prayer whatsoever. You could take the greatest warrior to walk the earth that has ever walked the earth. Doesn't stand a chance against a lion. Not one chance. Zero. A lion can kill any human being if they want to. Okay? But he kills a lion. He grabs him by the beard. Evidently, this was a male lion who had a big mane. He grabs him by the beard, and then he runs him through. Yeah, right, the world would say. But then he also talks about a bear. He killed a bear the same way. What's he telling Saul? About his own prowess? About how great he is as a warrior? No, what he's telling Saul is that I killed those two things because God did it. That's what he's saying. Because God won that battle for me. And though that lion and that bear is going to be just like, that uncircumcised Philistine is going to be just like that lion and bear. A battle where I stand no chance, but yet God's going to give me the victory. Quite a young man, wouldn't you say? Did God see the heart? Isn't that what he told Samuel? I don't judge by appearance, I judge the heart. And so, Saul says, go and may the Lord be with you. Because he heard the story, right? May the Lord be with you just like he was with you with the lion and the bear. So what does Saul try to do? Got to put this armor on, right? Doesn't fit. David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he's not tested them. They weren't something that he's used to, and they don't fit him. So David said to Saul, I cannot go out with these, for I've not tested them. I can't use these things. Will be worse for me to wear than not in the battle. And David took them off. Most armor was made for the person. It was made for the person, to fit the person, to better benefit them. And if you put somebody's armor on that was too small or too big, it would be too cumbersome or it would be getting in the way. So it was made for the individual. I can't wear this. So in verse 40, he takes a stick in his hand. That's the staff. That's the shepherd's staff. And chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, even in his pouch. And his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. He takes a weapon that he's familiar with. He doesn't take Saul's armor or his sword. He takes a weapon he's familiar with. It's called a staff sling. And they still use that in the Middle East. It's a stick about 4 or 5 feet long. And on one end of it there's a sling. It's a cloth, and it's tied to the end. And then what they do is they take a rock and they put it in there, and you close the top with your hand like this. So the rock is in it laying back. And then you start spinning it like this. And you let it go. It comes out with great velocity, if you will. The shepherds use that to scare off predators, like wild dogs and stuff, and they can hit them many yards out. I mean, I've seen videos of these guys using the staff slings, and it's a deadly weapon because it can go a long way. And when you start spinning that thing, you can get a lot of velocity in it and let that rock go. And so he's using something that he uses all the time, the staff sling. He's a shepherd. And so here comes in verse 41 the Philistine. He comes out and approaches David with his shield bearer. And he looks at David and he feels insulted by David. He's insulted by David coming out. He's a youth. He's a boy. He's not even a man. He's a boy. And not only that, he's ruddy. He's kind of rough in appearance. He's not. Am I a dog? He says in other words, that you should come out with sticks. So, see, Goliath recognizes it's a staff sling. Am I a dog that you would run me off with a rock, as you would if they were in the sheep? Am I a dog that you would use that weapon that you would use on wild dogs to run off when they try to get in your sheep? You coming to me with sticks? He cursed David. Come to me. I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Okay. Notice as we read what David said in verse 45. You come to me with all these things, sword, spear, and javelin. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. What's that mean, in the name of the Lord of hosts? By the authority of God. I come to you by the authority of the Lord, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. He's going to deliver you into my hands. You see, Goliath looked at David and says, how in the world can you defeat me with a stick that you run dogs off with? You don't understand. God's going to win the victory. I'm just here to do his will. He's going to strike you down and remove your head from you. I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth. And when that's done, verse 47, all this assembly will know that the Lord does not deliver by the power of men, the sword and the spear, but for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Any battle is the Lord's, guys. Every battle that's been fought is the Lord's. He determines the victor. He determines the victor. And so, they close, sling, boom, forehead, sinks in, falls over. David runs up, takes Goliath's sword, cuts Goliath's head off. What are the odds? 1,000,000 to 1, 2,000,000 to 1, 10,000,000 to 1? It was 1 to 1 because the Lord was there. That's the difference. It was 1 to 1 because the Lord was there. And so God gave him the victory. And then we see in verses 52 through 58 the aftermath, the victory and the pursuit and so forth, as Philistines run away and the armies of Israel chase them down in the victory. So here's David on the national scene. Now everybody's going to know who David is. You don't think this story won't spread like wildfire? Won't take long to get around that this young boy from Bethlehem, son of Jesse, David, defeated the champion of the Philistines, Goliath. Can you believe that? Can you believe that? And so it catapulted him up on the national stage. So from that point forward, you see, the things that he did began to become more known and more known. Because remember, in the eyes of the people, Saul is still king. And anybody that would rise up against Saul would be a usurper, would be a rebel, would be a traitor, if you will, in their eyes, in the eyes of the people. So God's got to bring this about over a period of time. So what are some spiritual lessons that we can take from this? Many, many spiritual lessons, but wrote down a couple here. Hope is helpful. Number one, the forces of evil can be scary, can't they? The forces of evil can seem overwhelming, can't they? Really, they can. I mean, Goliath was a scary guy, no doubt. And probably would scare me if he walked through the door back there, if you will. He was a scary guy. Sometimes evil seems bigger than it is. And the reason it seems bigger than it is because our faith is in the wrong place. Our faith is in ourselves rather than the God who's greater than the evil. So sometimes evil can seem scary, but we shouldn't let it keep us from acting because we have a God who's greater than the evil. I think a second spiritual lesson that we can take from this is even the least among us can be the greatest in God's eyes. God, it's fascinating the way God, throughout the Old Testament, you see that he uses what we would deem the least to achieve the greatest. Remember Gideon? I'm we're the least family in Manasseh, and I'm least in my family. Remember? No, you're a great warrior. You don't know it yet, but you're a great warrior, and you're going to deliver my people from the Midianites. And you take throughout the Bible the idea of the least to the greatest. Peter, a fisherman. Why didn't the Lord go to Jerusalem and choose his 12 from among the great rabbis of the nation? Think about that. He chose Peter, James, and John, fishermen. Common, everyday men. God's greatest achievements are through those who we deem as the least among men. Because God can see the heart, right? Instead of appearance. Even the least among us can be the greatest in God's eyes. Number 3, don't let the world discourage you in fighting the good fight. You're but a youth. Ruddy in appearance. You have no experience. You're a boy. How dare you come out and do this? And how dare you come out and do that? What I'm going to do to you, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to give your corpse to the birds of the sky. Well, that would be kind of discouraging to most people, facing a man like that. But the idea is, don't let the world say things about you that would discourage you. You're small, you're little, you don't mean anything. Right? Mm-hmm. How dare you stand up for antiquated ideas? How dare you tell us that we're sinning through this word that you have, and so forth. Discouraging things that could discourage us in our fight, because none of us like to be put in a corner. None of us like to be called names. But we know that David and that we serve something greater. You see, don't let the world discourage you in your fight, the good fight. I think another spiritual lesson is that take into your spiritual battle what God provides. You remember David's there. Saul says, okay, I'm going to put this armor on. That wasn't provided by God. It was provided by Saul, wasn't it? Take this into battle. This doesn't work. This is going to hurt me. I can't wear this. What did David do? He went down and chose what God provided, 5 smooth stones from the brook. God put the stones there, didn't he? The water that went over it that made it smooth. So he goes down to the brook and he chooses 5 stones that God provided for the battle. We have to rely on what God provides for us, what he does for us in that battle, in that spiritual battle, in our lives. We have to use the tools that he provides to fight the spiritual battles in our life, whether that be prayer and worship, grace, mercy, forgiveness. Because if I depend on myself too much, then I fall into the trap, if you will, of sin, and I stay in it. But I have to turn and take the tools of God in order to wash that sin from me and turn to him for the things that I need, like the Word of God, like encouragement from the brethren, things that God has provided for me in that spiritual battle. David went down and got 5 smooth stones out of the brook. God provided those. I think another spiritual lesson that we can take from this is it is God who gives the victory in whatever that is. You know, we can make all the plans in the world about what we're going to do in working for God, but ultimately, is it not God that gives the increase? Isn't that what Paul said? I plant, Apollos waters, but God gives the increase. The idea of letting God work in our lives. I've got to do this and I've got to do that. And that's true. And a lot of times we don't see results. But what happens in that, it can be sometimes discouraging. But in our spiritual battle and in our spiritual walk, it is God who gives the victory. It is God who gives the increase. It is He that, if you will, ultimately does the harvest. And so we're the workers, right? In the vineyard of the Lord, as we sung this morning. I want to be a worker for the Lord. We go out and pick the grapes that God always provided, because God provided the plant and the grapes. Use what God provided. He gives the victory in life. And let's be a little patient with God when it comes to those things, because He can see all ends. So I hope this has been helpful tonight, a little bit, in our spiritual walk. To have the courage of David, and the mindset of David in that situation, and to know that God's got his back, is something that's very impressive to me. What about you? It's very impressive to me. And really, there's no difference, is there? God's got our back too, doesn't He? And whether or not David went out, he lived or he died, he did the will of God. And the same true for you and I. God's got our back.
Ye that labor and are heavy